Anyway, thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you everybody else for joining us today. I can't even remember how many we've done of these now. It's probably the fourth or the fifth of our series of Meet the. We've had three authors, and then I was interviewed a couple of weeks ago. And today we have with us Lionel Ross. Lionel is a gentleman from Manchester, so he's a little bit more than 2 meters distant, but he is nevertheless hopefully able to hear me and see me. I'll tell you a little bit about Lionel before we start. Lionel is quite a prolific author, actually, although he will claim he hasn't got any time for writing anymore. But he has written 8 books, which we will talk about, and the 9th is in its gestation period. The gestation period seems to be quite long, though, but it's on its way. But apart from that, Lionel is also a publisher, and we'll talk about that as well, because it's quite an interesting development in his life when he became a publisher. So let me start, Lionel, by asking you a little bit of your backstory. Where do you come from originally, and how did you get to be where you are now?
Where I came from was Leeds originally as a tiny baby. My parents decided without consulting me that they'd like to move to Manchester when I was about a year old. And I spent most of the rest of my life in Manchester. Where I came from after that was I went through the usual schooling, limited schooling in those days to what is expected today. But I then went into the textile industry, and I spent the next 40, 50 years in the textile industry.
Which is not surprising for Manchester, really, is it? I mean, I guess textiles and Manchester go hand in hand, don't they?
They do very much so. They did. Today, I think it'd be hard-pressed to find much textile industry, except possibly a few of the Asian community who have textile shops and import and wholesale. But other than that, no, not really anymore. It's all changed completely. But that's like everywhere else.
You're Leeds-born but Manchester-bred. So are you a Yorkshireman? Oh, which rows do you support?
Well, if it's cricket, I would probably still support Yorkshire. But if it's soccer, Manchester City.
Right. Okay. So you're mixing it up.
I'm mixing it up. I'm a silly mixed-up kid. Yeah.
So you're in this textile business for a long time. So when did the change in your career happen?
Well, it happened gradually because the textile industry became increasingly difficult, and I felt that it was time to make a change, and I went into publishing town centre maps and guides after a short period of what should we say, investigating that business. It's something that appealed to me, and I started this as a new business, and it went reasonably well for a few years. But then, with the increasing encroaching of the internet onto maps and so on, demand became less and less, and I was still working in maps and guides, just finding it rather more difficult. And at that time, somebody approached me by email because they saw I was a publisher. They found me on the primitive Google search that there was in those days, and they asked me if I'd publish a book. I had just written my first book and had it published in America, and my first reaction was, oh, well, I don't know how to go about this. And then I thought to myself, I have designers designing the maps. I can edit myself, so I'll help this fellow out, and I did, and I published this book. Having done that, I thought, this is a very interesting field. It's something I'd love to do. I've always loved books. I've always loved reading, and I love writing. And so that was really the beginning of the publishing business.
But just to wind back slightly, how did you make the jump from textiles to publishing maps and guides? It sounds a bit of a leap.
Well, I mean, at the time, bluntly, the textile industry was leaving me rather than me leaving it. And it was getting increasingly financially difficult. And I needed to find something else. And looking around, there was a job going with a map and guide company, and I decided I'd take it. And I took it, and I soon found out that the way this guy was operating was not really doing himself or any of the other people who were working for him any favours. And I was then approached by one of the town centre managers, who said to me, I'd like to get a new town centre guide done, but I certainly wouldn't want him to do it. Would you do it for me? I said, well, you know, I do work for them, but I'm not very happy because I can see they're upsetting everybody. And so I then thought, what the heck, I'm going to do this. So I knew exactly how to go about it. I didn't have the staff, but I gradually recruited the necessary people and finished off. I mean, we used to do our own maps, which was very interesting because I used to trot over to the Barton Airport here in Manchester, which is a small local airport. And I used to have a guy who used to do aerial photography for me. And he used to go up and take photos of the appropriate towns and come back with all these photos. He understood the business, he'd done it before. And it was very interesting. Then I had map group, people who would do maps on a freelance basis from the photography, and the whole thing just developed. It was very interesting.
You wrote your first book. Were you publishing before you wrote your first book, or which came first?
No, the first book, Fine Feathers, came first. And in fact, it has a textile background. Yeah, which I was still not such a distant memory.
So tell us a little bit about that book and how it came to be, because obviously the first book is probably either the most difficult or the most significant. I'm not quite sure. How do you regard that book now?
I didn't regard it as difficult at the time. It's not my greatest book. It's an entertaining story. I wanted to write a story really about a young man who was obsessed with money to the exclusion of all else, even a normal young man's pursuits of girls and all the rest of it. All he really wanted to do was to make lots and lots of money in the textile industry. Good luck to him after what I'd just been through, but there we go. And he started to build up a business. Unfortunately, because of his character defects, things went wrong for him. And that's all in the story of Fine Feathers. So I mean, he gradually had to learn the old saying that fine feathers don't make fine birds.
That picture of the front of the book looks like it's from a film set. Has anybody ever approached you to make any films of your books?
I've been frequently, almost every book I've written and quite a lot of the books I've published, people say to me, oh, that would make a wonderful film. But getting a film done, I've had books over in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, as they call it. But they've always come back and said, yeah, this would be a great film, but we haven't got the budget for it.
So tell us a little bit about how it went from there. I mean, the first book, do you regard it as being a success? I mean, did it whet your appetite for more?
Oh, it did whet my appetite. Because I find this with myself, and I find it with other people. Once you have written one book, you've got the bug, and you tend to like to keep writing and to be creative. As I said, with Fine Feathers, the main point was to get across the idea of this young man who was obsessed with money. My second book was a Jewish history book, Hidden Heritage. And there I wanted to take a Jewish family who expelled from Spain in 1492 and shipwrecked on the coast of Southern Ireland in a very wild, inhospitable place. And that's what I did. And I mean, having sort of got that theme going, I wanted to see it through. And so I wrote about this family. They're called Mendoza, quite a common Spanish Jewish name. And that book turned out to be very popular, particularly with Jewish people, but with non-Jewish people as well, because there's a lot of Irish history in it as well. and it worked very well.
I think I remember you telling me, is it the most popular of the books that you've written, Hidden Heritage, or are there others?
I wouldn't say now, no. I mean, I think a few years later, I mean, I wrote some more books after that, but I think Men of Conviction did very well. Men of Conviction has done extremely well because, I mean, it had three different strands going in it. One was just common criminality caused by poverty of an ordinary English guy from one of the worst suburbs of Manchester, well, not a suburb, worst areas of Manchester. And then the second guy was a Haredi Jew who was never taught any idea of how to make a living. And the third guy was a Muslim who was brought up in the lap of luxury, but he became obsessed, as the expression is radicalized, which is a strange expression, but that's what people say. And he was on the way to being a terrorist. In fact, he became a terrorist.
So what, is there a theme that runs through your books? I mean, they're all very different. I mean, the storylines are very different. I mean,
they are, yeah.
The only thing they seem to have in common is that I guess they're all fictional. But I mean, what is it that hold? Does anything hold them together? The books?
No, I mean, not really, no. I mean, I tend to put in Jewish characters, but that's only because I know Jewish people, but I mean, I know lots of non-Jewish people as well. And so it's not very difficult, but I just like to put in at least one or two Jewish characters. My book, the Dalethorpe was based in Lancashire. And of course, I knew Lancashire from my textile days. And but it started way back with the Vikings. But even then, the Viking chief captured a Jewish girl in Paris when they were raiding Paris, as they did. I mean, I tried to get my history right. Yeah. And so even there was a Jewish character. There were Jewish characters in that as well, but only peripherally.
History seems to be a bit of a theme. You like your history?
Oh, I love history, yeah.
And I mean, yeah. These books cover quite a long, I mean, 1,000 years of.
Yeah, it's quite a long time. Yeah, that book was very popular, actually. It went very well. Dalethorpe Chronicles, because I called it Chronicles because it was going, people actually, the word Chronicles did cause a problem because I used to get people coming up and saying, oh, do we have to buy more than one? When I was book signing in Borders and Waterstones. But no, once they understood the Chronicles were all in the one book, it was okay.
You mentioned book signings there. I mean, book signings were once upon a time quite a major way of publicising books, but do you do those anymore? No.
No, I don't. Well, I mean, I wouldn't be doing it now anyway, because I'm working most of 6 days a week. So I wouldn't really have the time to start making trips, but I used to go to about 40 or 50 different branches of Waterstones. I used to go to the Borders branches. Borders were wonderful bookshops, as most of you will remember. And it was a great tragedy that they couldn't keep things going and closed down. But we know why they couldn't keep things going, because I knew people in the Borders branch that was down here in Manchester. People used to come in, friends of mine had come in, and they'd chat about my books, and they'd buy my book, one or two of my books. And then they'd say, I'm just going to have a look what's new. And they'd have a pad with them. They'd write down the names of the books and go home and order them on Amazon. Well, how on earth did they think that Borders were going to keep going with their lounges and with their beautiful furnishings and all the rest of it, and an excellent system without money? And that's basically it. And that's, well, I mean, we see that now with every trade throughout. I mean, forgetting the coronavirus problems. I mean, we saw it last year with the closures of stores because people buy more and more online. And the more they buy online, the less shops are going to be.
But you say people buy more and more online, but it's still the case, isn't it? The majority of books are not online. The majority of books are still on paper, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm not talking about the electronic books. I'm talking about paper books.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about people saying, oh, this is a good title, I'll order it on Amazon. And a couple of days later, the postman brings the book.
I see, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not talking, e-books are a separate matter altogether.
Well,
E-books are important in their own way.
It's worth exploring, though, isn't it? Because your books are available on Amazon, but when you say they're available on Amazon, are they available on Kindle? Are they available both on paper and on Kindle?
Yeah, we do. I mean, nearly every book we publish both as a paperback and as a Kindle.
And what's the breakdown between sales?
Kindle have their place in the scheme of things at the moment. Kindles are going up and up and up. I've just seen the sales figures for last month, and they are leaping up because I think people at present time have good reasons for wanting not to have paper books, but normally paper books are still a very big part of the market.
So what would you say is the normal percentage, and what's happening in the lockdown according to the latest figures?
Well, I think what had happened originally with ebooks, they'd taken about 25% of the market. Then it started to dwindle as people still felt they loved to hold a book in their hands. So they only bought Kindles more. I mean, some people buy Kindles all the time, but the general average works out that people started more to buy paperbacks again, and it got down to about 15% of the market. But now I suspect it's gone up to 25 to 30% because judging by our own figures, we're selling more and more Kindles. We're selling lots of books as well because people are reading more while they're in lockdown.
Well, I buy stuff on Kindle, and it always amazes me that you can buy stuff on Kindle for 99p. So I mean, how does anybody make any money out of that?
Well, on Kindle, you have to remember one thing. I mean, I'm not suggesting 99p is a particularly economic price, but I mean, for 2 or 3 quid, you can get loads of excellent books. You get books we publish for 2 or 3 quid on Kindle, and they're lovely books. But the point is, we never have to print them again.
Mm-hmm.
Once they're up there, they're up there. They're floating around. And anybody can download them and just pay their 2 or 3 quid or 4 quid or whatever it is, and they've got themselves a Kindle. Obviously, larger books are a bit more expensive, but they're always substantially cheaper than paperbacks.
You mentioned that the chronicles that weren't chronicles, but you are writing a trilogy, aren't you? So how's the trilogy going?
I'm writing a trilogy.
Yeah, a trilogy in 2 parts.
I'm writing a book. Sorry?
It's a trilogy in 2 parts, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a trilogy in 2 parts at the moment. I've done about, I think, 28,000 words of the 3rd book. But I think I've touched it just a few times in the last year. It's a total embarrassment to me, but I mean, the publishing business has just grown and grown. And the result is I've just had less and less time to write myself. And although I've now got excellent editors and so on, I still find I'm spending so much time answering emails, and I also choose every new book that comes out myself. So it's all very time consuming. I just don't get time to write, but it's embarrassing, as I said. When I go to shul, to a kiddush, I'll always get somebody coming up to me and saying, "What's happened to that 3rd book?"
So tell us about the first 2 books anyway, the 2 thirds of them.
The first 2 books are Adolphus and Amelie. It's a trilogy about a family called Bergman who start out life, as far as we're concerned, in Manchester and in Berlin. And the son of the Berlin branch comes over to Manchester in 1912, significantly just before a year or 2 before the First World War, and asked to stay with his long-lost uncle. He goes out at night, and he behaves in some fairly suspicious ways. And his cousins, his Manchester cousins, decide he is a spy. And they were right. And he then eventually told them just before he left that he was actually a reserve officer in the Kaiser's army, which is not unusual because there were way over 100,000 Jewish boys in the Kaiser's army in the First World War, and about 60,000 Jewish boys in the British army. But that's the start of the book. So it then goes through the First World War, and it finishes in the early days after the First World War, in the early 1920s. The second book, Amelie, then goes into the first storm clouds of the Nazi period, and it then goes through the Nazi period with this same family, with Adolphus's son, and on until through the Nazi period and what happens to them during all this period. And the third book is supposed to be, which isn't written yet, it starts out again with the grandson in the post-war period in 1950s, 1940s, 1950s, and what happens there. But that's called Rudolph, but it's not out yet anyway, so there we go.
But I seem to think that Adolphus was actually based on a real-life incident in your family, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's one very small but quite significant incident that my father told me about. He was 8 years old at the time, but he lived in Leeds, and the long-lost cousin did turn up from Germany, and he wasn't. Well, they didn't know he was a German soldier. He never told them in the real life, and he stayed in Leeds. And my father's older brothers kept saying, "We're sure that he is a spy." And so that was the start of it. So that just gave me, that was the kickstart, if you like. That just turned on the ignition. But from there on in, the book took over itself, and the story of the Bergmans was very, very different to my own family.
So which of these books, so we're talking about 8 books and one still in gestation, which is your personal favourite, or do you have one?
I think I have 2, really. Men of Conviction, about the 3 guys who come out of jail on the same day, and Adolphus, I think, are my complete favourites. But I like them all to a varying extent. Fine Feathers, which was my first, which I probably could criticise now, but people have enjoyed it very much. And, you know, one often has doubts about what one does oneself anyway.
Turning briefly, we'll let our audience ask you some questions in a minute, but turning briefly to the publishing side of all this,
yeah.
It's quite a big concern. I mean, you're making it sound like it's growing very well, is it? How many books do you publish?
Well, we're now publishing about 3 or 4 books a month. So, I mean, in comparison with the huge multinationals, we're a pinprick. But it's become now quite a reasonably established. I think we're probably the largest general publisher in the northwest of England, yeah. Which isn't saying an awful lot. I mean, there is the Manchester University Press, which is an excellent publishing house. But other than that, the others all tend to be specialists, and we're not specialists. My motto is we will publish anything we can understand. So that tends to leave out brain surgery, interstellar flight, and a few other things. Yeah. But anything we can understand, which really usually boils down to history and present-day life and politics and religion. I mean, you know, I published books for Muslims. I published books for a very dear friend who is a Church of England clergyman who was actually a judge in London originally. And I publish books for any number of different people. I publish yoga books, and anything that is within our grasp, we will consider. It's got to be well written, and it's got to be, you know, it's got to be done like, you know, in a reasonable way. But I mean, my senior editor now, who joined me last year, he is absolutely brilliant, and he will in fact work with authors to build their book, to make it more credible. And you know, this is a tremendous thing to be able to do that. I mean, not everybody can. I mean, editors can edit up to a point, but I mean, he is well beyond that, and it's really very satisfying to have somebody like him on the team.
Do you get as much pleasure from publishing as you do from writing? I mean, is it pleasurable publishing?
That's an impossible question. I really love writing, the creativity of it once I get down to it. But it's not happening very often lately, and I am getting my kicks out of publishing, because I mean, I get the loveliest emails from people saying, "You've made my dream come true," and things like that, and it really is so satisfying. And you know, I make a living out of it. I don't think I'm going to wax exceedingly rich, but I'm very satisfied with the living I'm making. I'm also very glad to be making people happy. As an old man, I think that gives me a lot of satisfaction.
I was just thinking, you don't look like an old man, but do you consider yourself an old man, and are you thinking about retiring? Like,
well, only thank God, only in numbers, and the fact that I'm locked in here, because I mean I am 85 this year, but you know, you're as old as you feel, and if God has granted you reasonable health, which so far He has, I'm very grateful, and. I don't really feel like an old man at all. I use this expression because of it's numbers, but all ages numbers. I know people of 50 who are old. I know people in their 90s who are young. You know, it's really more to do with here than anything else, although the health has to be right too.
Are you expecting that because of the lockdown that you'll find a wealth of new talent knocking on your door and saying, "Well, I've always wanted to write a book, and this I had the chance to write it"? And I mean, is that happening yet? Or would you...
Oh, it is happening. It started happening almost from the very beginning. People started approaching me and saying to me exactly that. I wrote this a few years ago. I'm just going to ginger it up a little bit. Will you have a look at it for me? And of course, I mean, we do that. I mean, we're very happy to help people as much as we possibly can, and I've got lots of that happens very frequently. It happened before, but it's happening more than ever, obviously, with the lockdown.
Okay, Lionel, I think we've been talking for about half an hour, so I think if we can bear with the technology a bit, we'll try and get Stefan to see if he can spot anybody who wants to ask a question, and let's see how we get on with that. So just hold your breath and see if it works.
Okay, so we'll open the meeting for questions. If you want to ask a question, you can either wave your hand in the air and hope that I spot you. You can use the chat if you want to get my attention that way, or you could also use the raise hand facility within the chat. So I think let's see if we've got anybody with any questions at the moment. Let's see how we go. So look, I think David Sophia, did you have a question? I think, David, I'm going to unmute you.
Yes, thanks very much. Lionel, I'd like to ask you a two-part question, if I may. The first is actually more of a thank you, because I'm sorry to say that I wasn't aware of your books until this afternoon, but I am pleased to tell you that I will, as soon as possible, try and acquire one of them. The one, I think it's called Hidden Heritage, because I'm fascinated by any story that takes somebody from mainland Europe and dumps them in Southern Ireland, because it's pretty much what happened to me myself. And be very interested to see how that develops. The second question, genuine question, is really a professional one, because I'm very much involved in copyright. The music industry has shown, or has seen, that in the lockdown there's been a tremendous change in the way that people are consuming and accessing, particularly streaming music. I think that ALCS has done a lot of research as well to see whether something similar is happening, or something perhaps not quite so similar is happening in the book industry, because of people having either more time to read or not sitting on a train commuting, etc., etc. But what I was fascinated by is your comment that although there's very little to be earned from ebooks and so on, that of course there's no need to have the production costs and the distribution costs that they used to have. Do you think, therefore, ultimately, that you will find it easier to find commercially viable publishing opportunities if the market is actually pivoting towards non-physical books? Because it might actually be economically easier rather than more difficult to make a living as a publisher.
Okay, thank you. That's very, very interesting questions. First of all, I hope you enjoy Hidden Heritage. As far as ebooks are concerned, I'd just like to make it clear that ebooks at the moment are having something of a resurgence. They came on the scene a few years ago. They gobbled up at quite a bit of a market, but not an impossible amount. They then started drifting downwards again because people still like books. And I think people still like books. Most people like to hold a book in their hands. But there are times when, for example, you're going on holiday and you're going away for 2 or 3 weeks. I know holidays are not something we know about anymore since coronavirus, but if somebody's going on holiday and instead of buying 6, 8 books, if they're a really avid reader, and sitting by the pool reading all the time, they download them all on Kindle. So for that, it's excellent. But when they're in their own home and they're sitting comfortably in their own lounge and they want to read, and mostly there is still a preference for hardcover, for books, for hard books. Does that answer you? Good question, thank you.
I think we've got a question now, I think from Paul Hart. Paul, if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, you run a publishing house. If Jane Austen approached you to publish her books, would you publish them, as she had great difficulty getting her own books published in her time? I believe she only ever made £450 from the publishing of her own books.
Very good question. In actual fact, I think you'll find that most of the famous authors, certainly from that time onwards, I mean, I don't think Dickens had any problem, but most of the famous authors from later in the 19th century had difficulty in getting published. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it becomes increasingly difficult. What people find is that publishing houses very often are very, I mean, in my opinion, I shouldn't really say this on air, but in my opinion, a lot of the publishing industry is still set in certainly the mid 20th century, certainly not in the 21st century. And as a youngster, I love technology, and to me, the important thing is to apply technology to the publishing industry, which is what I've set out to do, and how we make it work for people. And I'm not just talking about ebooks. I mean, I'm talking about the sort of printers we use and the way we operate, and the fact it's all done on computers. But having said all that, I know Jeffrey Archer had loads and loads of rejection slips. And so, and in fact, many of the hugely successful authors found it very, very hard to get going in the first place. So, I mean, it's nothing new. Poor old Jane Austen, I didn't realise that, but I mean, £400 odd, I suppose in those days was a little bit better than it sounds now. Does that answer your question?
Okay, I think it's Wendy is holding her.
Hello. Yes, I was just wondering how your job connects in with people who self-publish. I've heard of self-publishing and people raising money by funding and all that kind of thing. Is that what you would help people with?
Yep. We get quite a lot of people coming to us who have self-published, and but usually as just as ebooks, occasionally as printed books, and they find out that the books are not edited properly, if at all. The covers are usually they're supplied over the internet with a number of different covers which are standard images, and they're asked to choose an image for their cover. The covers are uninspiring, therefore, and as far as the quality of the writing, because it's not edited properly, is concerned, it's not very good. And I often get people coming to me and saying, you know, I published on, it's difficult if they published a paperback, but not impossible. But they come to me sometimes and say, well, I published a Kindle, it's not selling, and the few people that have bought it say there's a lot wrong with it. Would you consider taking it on? So, well, we consider it. We try and help them if we can. I mean, it may not be possible. I mean, the book may be inherently no good, I mean, unfortunately. But very often, self-publishing, there's companies out there, lots of them are really just trying to make a fuss buck. It's rather like vanity publishing, where I actually had experience of vanity publishing. You've heard of vanity publishing, haven't you? I had the experience of vanity publishing myself with my second book, just at the time when I was busy publishing the book for this first author that I met, where on the self-publishing, on vanity publishing, I decided to send it to a publisher in this country who I thought was a respectable publisher. And they came back to me and said, oh yes, we'd love to publish this. And we'll give you 50 books, hardcover, which we don't, well, I mean, hardcover I hardly do at all today. And we'll charge you £9,000. And I thought, thanks, but no thanks. I mean, that's what happens with vanity publishers. They're just out to rip people off who are desperate to get their books published. And it's very sad, really. But I think people learn. And if you go on the internet with some of these firms, you'll find they've got terrible reviews.
Okay, any more questions for Lionel? Put your hand up.
Hello.
Can I ask something, Lionel? I was just we were talking earlier about the books you've written and the role that history plays in them.
Yeah.
One of your books is set in the future, isn't it? Which are Souls Apart.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of wondering, well, you can tell us a little bit about the book, but given it talks about, I presume, Britain in the grip of a dictatorial government, whether you worry about what's going on at the moment and think we might be moving in that direction.
No, I don't.
Well, tell us about the book. Tell us about the book.
I mean, this is a story of twins. One of who were they were non-Jewish. One of them grew up, was converted, and became a rabbi.
Yes.
And he was a very sweet guy. And the other was an obsessive and corrupt individual who just wanted to, and he went in the army initially, and the opportunities came up. I mean, history has gone off in a different direction now altogether, but the government that he formed was absolutely dictatorial. It was like a Nazi government or a Stalinist government. I mean, it was just it was nothing at all to do like a democratic government that you would have today. So it's a very different sort of story. But the contrast between the two guys who were twins was what I was trying to get across. And also the fact that Britain at that stage was in danger of drifting into an army dictatorship.
You don't think that's a danger anymore, obviously? I
don't, not at all. No, we have a democratic government. Some people support them, some people don't. And I don't see it at all, and I don't think that the people that are in power have any inclination to go in that direction. I'm not talking about America, I'm talking about here.
But I was sort of wondering, do you actually fancy the idea of writing any more books set in the future as opposed to the past?
Yeah, I do sometimes. I sometimes think about what the world will be like when the virus eventually gets down to scale. Whether it'll ever go completely, I don't know, but whether it's reduced sufficiently for the vast majority of people in this country not to worry about it. And I do wonder what the world will be like then, because the world has changed radically, and I don't see how it's going to change back after all this. There's going to be many, many differences.
Okay, look, we've got more people waiting to question you, so I'll hand you back to Stefan, and we've got some more questions for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I've got a question from Jackie, and then we got Philip, and then we got Peter. So let's go to Jackie first.
Hi, I'm interested in the mechanics of writing, whether you spend a lot of time researching the history of the book that you're planning to write, and whether you actually decide I'm going to write 1,000 words a day, or you just take a lot of time, just the mechanics of the writing process.
Yep. There are really two sorts of authors. There's the authors who plan out everything from A to Z on paper, making little notes all the way through, and chapter by chapter by chapter, they have it all planned out before they even start. I'm talking fiction, obviously, and there's people who start to write. And I think it's about 50-50. I mean, I know loads of famous authors I've heard interviewed, and authors I've chatted to. Some of them say, "Oh, I've got to be organised," and then there's others who, like me, start a book and like to let it develop a mind of its own and a way of its own, and take over. And I mean, I can remember a few years ago coming downstairs for dinner and saying to Louise, "Oh, you know, so and so." One particular thing that comes to mind was a girl got kidnapped onto a boat in Ireland, in Hidden Heritage, and I got her kidnapped onto it. And then I suddenly thought to myself, now how the hell am I going to get her off that boat? And I had to think through a plot to get her off again. And if I wouldn't have let her get kidnapped onto it in the first place, this would never have happened. And it's much more entertaining. It's more natural, I feel, more natural to life. But there are people who have written wonderful books which are all well organised.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we got a question now from Philip.
Hello, Lionel.
Hello, Philip.
Hello, it's been great to hear what you've had to say, but a strange question. You're obviously a very, very busy man, but do you read for pleasure yourself? And if you do, what books have you really enjoyed in the last couple of years?
I have to tell you, I'm reading, when I'm not emailing, I'm reading all day. And I'm evaluating books on a big screen here, and not on this laptop. I have a big screen next to me as well. And when I finished reading in the evening, I have to admit, that's it. I read the newspapers, I read magazines, I have one or two political magazines I like to read, and I read one or two religious books as well. But other than that, I don't do much reading for pleasure. The only thing I would say is if I've selected a book which I thought was very, very good and interesting, and I've had no other part in the production, we'll say my senior editor has edited it, and I might take it away on holiday with me as one of the books I'm taking. But other than that, I'm afraid I'm not reading as much as I used to.
Okay, and we've got a question now from Peter. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Peter.
Yes, it's Peter Lantos. Hello, I am a guest here. I'm a guest here but in a fortnight time, I'm going to sit in your chair because being interviewed by Stephen. And it's not a question, but really a comment. you meant that one area you definitely would not publish is neuroscience, or rather neurosurgery. Now, I shouldn't give you advice because you are eminently successful, but it's Henry Marsh, my colleague, published a book, Do No Harm, which is a story of life, death, and brain surgery, which sold 179,000 copies. So one never knows which area of human activity may turn out to be a major success. That was just that comment that, you know,
it's a good comment. It's a very good comment.
That you would not publish in the field of brain surgery. So
that was really a joke. I mean, basically, we try to be open-minded, but there are technical subjects we're just not qualified to publish. And I mean, you reach a point where you have to know when it is just not for you. But you're quite right that, I mean, one must be open-minded. And I think I am open-minded.
Thank you very much.
I can say on the subject.
Thank you.
And good luck with your talk in a couple of weeks.
Right, I think we've got another question. Let me see if I can find it a second. Somebody was waving their hand. I can see somebody. The name is Helen Ellison, but I assume it's not Helen asking the question. Go ahead.
Hi, hi Lionel.
Yeah, hi Marvin.
Yeah, I followed your career very closely, and I've read all your books. And I'm also going to say, what about the last book?
Well, you heard what I said, didn't you?
But what I want to say,
you're just somebody else putting me on the spot.
what I want to say to everybody, I can certainly recommend this is not a plug. I'm not a plant, by the way, but I can certainly recommend Lionel's books. They are great reading, especially the one about what goes on. They go from Spain to Ireland. That book is fantastic. And the Adolphus trilogy, brilliant. So I can certainly go out and go online and buy Lionel's books now. Can you pay me my commission later, Lionel? Thank you. Nice to see you.
Sure, you're not a plant. I mean, I'll see you afterwards, yes? You're a long way away, 200 odd miles away, but never mind.
Well, we haven't seen you for ages.
No, unfortunately, only on screen.
Lionel, you can give somebody else a plug as well if you want, because I believe one of the authors we're hoping to interview in a few weeks' time is Sir Eric Reich.
Oh yes,
and I think you might have published his book. So tell us a little bit about, or give him a plug.
Yeah, I will give him a plug. I mean, Sir Eric Reich's book is an excellent book, and it's quite fascinating because he came over on kinder transport, and his statue is in Liverpool Street Station with all the other children who arrived at that time. And he's had a very interesting career. His book is very much worth reading. And what I would say is that I just want to find a little anecdote that occurred when I saw him. There's his cover now there he is at the front, the little guy. Yeah. And what happened was I went to see him with his good lady in their flat. And he then, after we talked about his book, he then said to me, "What family do you have?" So I said, "I have 2 sons, 6 grandchildren. I don't think I had any great-grandchildren then. Maybe I had 1. And he said, "Your wife is called Louise?" I said, "Yes." And then, I don't know, Louise is actually my 3rd wife. I mean, we've been married, thank God, for 30 odd years, very, very happily indeed, but she is my 3rd wife. And something just made me say, well, actually, Louise is my 3rd wife. And Sir Eric turned around to me and said, well, Linda here is my 4th wife. I've never forgotten that.
Is she in the statue as well?
No, I don't think so.
And the book is actually called The Boy in the Statue because...
The Boy in the Statue, yes. You've seen the cover on there. It's a lovely book. I mean, those sort of books are always very, very popular, very successful. I mean, it keeps selling. I think he keeps doing talks.
Yeah.
And I think, but it goes anyway. I mean, it's a lovely story. Equally, I have another Holocaust book, which is a very, very wonderful book, and that's a book which was written only last year, published last year by Agnes Capozzi. It is called Yellow Star, Red Star, and the lady who is actually was actually born in Hungary. And she was educated in Hungary and started her school life when the war started, and eventually the Nazis came in. She was a forced labourer under the Nazis, and she then came back to Hungary again to discover that the Soviets were going to take over, and that was going to give her another type of difficulty in her life. Until the 56, when she actually escaped. But her book is a wonderful, wonderful book. She lectures a lot, actually. March of the Living, the Beit Shalom in Nottingham. She does loads and loads of lectures. Now, of course, she's doing them on screen like we all are. But that is a brilliant, brilliant book, Yellow Star, Red Star.
Okay, Lionel, I'm just wondering, Stephanie, are there any other people waiting to ask questions?
I'm just going to have a quick look for you. In fact, we're actually honoured to have Agnes on the Zoom with us today, Lionel. She's actually here.
Oh, good.
I'm going to unmute Agnes a second.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Agnes.
I have known Lionel this last year and a half, and this is the first time I realized that he was not only a most helpful and charming publisher, but also an author, and that's my ignorance, and I welcome the opportunity. But I have questions which are to the editor. When would you say that a book is successful? How do you measure success? Do you measure it by the number of copies sold, or the amount of money it puts into your pocket, or by the review it gets, or whatever? This is my first question. And the other is a technical question. You, in passing, mentioned that nowadays hardbacks are rare. Why is that?
Right, okay. Well, the answer to the first question is, I mean, really, they all go together. I mean, if a book is selling well in numbers of copies, it's obviously going to produce more pennies. It's also going to produce more reviews. But I mean, obviously you get some books which haven't done particularly well, but which the people who have read it give glowing reviews. This does happen, so you do get a certain imbalance. But generally, the three things go together. As far as, what was your second question? Sorry.
Why are hardbacks rare? Why do you say that nowadays books are usually softbacks?
Yeah, because from a practical, first of all, there's cost. Production of hardcover books is more expensive. But secondly, it's to do with weight. If, for example, if most books sold now are sold by Amazon and some by Waterstone's website and so on, they're all going to be posted. And hardcover books cost a fortune to post. So people, for a couple of pounds or so, you can send off a softcover book quite easily. And hardcover, and also I think the technology today for producing reasonable quality soft covers is so much better than it used to be. I mean, when I was a youngster, soft cover books, paperback books were paperback books. They were rubbish, you know. But today, I mean, they're nice, they're well designed, and they're a good quality card. It's not much of a problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions, Agnes. Nice to see you.
Right, just see if we've got anybody else with any last questions for Lionel, I should say.
I want to just comment on one other thing, but if there's questions, we'll take the questions first.
Go ahead, Lionel, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to tell you that we can also act very, very quickly if we need to. And 5 weeks ago, I had a phone call here in my office from a young man who told me that he was a chef and that he was he'd written a cookery book, not a huge cookery book, but a book of an adequate number of recipes for all different meals, and that he was the chef of a huge school in South Manchester, funnily enough, a school that my sons went to 50 odd years ago, before he was born. And he asked me if I could help him to publish this cookery book with the proceeds going to the NHS. And not the NHS itself, of course, the government pays them, but to the staff of the NHS, which is called NHS Charities Together. And I thought this is a wonderful thing to do. All these people really deserve our support. I mean, we hear a lot about that, but they really do. And we pulled all the stops out. My designer, Dino, designed the book. We got a lovely book out, family called it's called if I'm just trying Lockdown Family Cooking. Lockdown Family Cooking. There it is on the screen now, and it's only £6.99, and all royalties are denoted to the NHS Charities Together. So I felt this was a very nice thing to do, and it's going very, very well. Not surprisingly. In fact, some of my wife's friends have been on the phone saying they've had their copies now and how much they've enjoyed it. So there we go. I just wanted to give it a plug.
Okay, Lionel, I think, thank you very much for that. And we've also been plugging our future guests as well. So thank you, Agnes and Peter, for turning up. And hopefully we will be able to see you again in the future. And I want to say thank you, Lionel, for a very interesting hour. The hour's flown past. And I hope you've enjoyed it and not found it too...
I most certainly have. Thank you for asking me. I have enjoyed it tremendously. I think I said to you the other day on the phone, I love answering questions.
I like asking questions.